St Ives has been a harbour obviously since the 13th century, the 14th century. We know there was a pier here in the 14th century. It was slightly further in towards the town centre. The pier was inadequate. It only ever could shelter a few small boats. And as St Ives grew in the 18th century, it was clear that it needed more in the way of protected harbour. So they got hold of John Smeaton, the greatest engineer of his time, and he came down in 1766. He produced a series of designs and he built what's now known as Smeaton's Pier, which is the first two-thirds, if you like, of the pier that now survives. And this was a huge improvement. It enabled St Ives to actually engage in coastal traffic, in merchanting fish and other materials to a wider area of Europe, not just locally. And it's a magnificent structure of solid Zena granite. Sand has always been a problem in St Ives. As early as 1538, John Leland, writing in his travels around Cornwall, mentions the fact that the harbour was choked up with sand and the town had actually moved over towards the south side of the harbour. In 1602, Carew mentions the fact that the harbour is next to useless because it's choked with sand, and you can still see the sand building up now. Even after Smeaton built his pier, the sand was still a problem. They cut through the pier with the huge great sluice gates that you can see to try and sluice out the sand. Unfortunately, the waves were getting in and smashing the boats up, so it didn't last very long. Smeaton's answer was to build a wall across the back of St Ives, across Porthmeor, to stop the sand being blown in from Porthmeor and choking up the harbour. So, although by the 19th century, pilchard had become the dominant fishing industry, in fact the dominant industry in many ways in St Ives, you must think that pilchard fishing, that level of fishing, in the end only requires a sloping beach, a good foreshore and processing and storage buildings ashore. It doesn't require the rather large investment in piers that we see here today. We're actually standing on the site of the medieval pier, and even there you can see it enclosed quite a large area. This was for trading vessels. St Ives was a port and a borough and a market town, and it was trading with France and Spain. It was importing timber and wax and tallow and leather. It was exporting, yes, fish, but also wool and hides and all sorts of local products. This is much more than just pilchard fishing. You have to imagine this harbour full to the brim with large coastal vessels, 3 masters, big boats. And of course, one of the main reasons why you have these large boats trading in and out of the port is because of the mining industry. And mining has been taking place in and around St Ives since at least the 14th century. And St Ives was one of the great mining towns and centres in Cornwall. Not just in the countryside around and about and up the Stenach and in the hills to the back of St Ives, but in the very heart of the town. Pednoble Point, the hotel, stands on the site of a former mine engine house, and there are still the remains of the stones underneath the hotel of that original engine house. We're standing here on what was the wharf of the medieval town, in fact the post-medieval town. The pier was just over there, and all the goods really were landing here. The road behind didn't actually exist until the 1920s, so what you're looking at is the backs of private little access lanes and alleys down to the waterside. But most of the goods were landed here and moved up 4th Street behind me to the main market area. Now here's an interesting thing, virtually every 4th Street in Cornwall literally means the street before you get to the marketplace. The roads come in from the countryside, they converge on the end of the Fourth Street. The Fourth Street leads into the market area. In St Ives, the Fourth Street starts here at the harbour. There is no hinterland as such. This is St Ives hinterland. This is a port. Fourth Street lands from the wharf into the market area. It's a reversal of what you normally expect to find, and it's possibly one of the unique features of St Ives. Leading off from the wharf area and indeed from 4th Street was a whole network of tiny little lanes and alleys and yards, and these were filled with the medieval and post-medieval traditional pilchard pressing cottages and yards. It was a small domestic scale industry, and every single house you see actually underneath it probably has the remains of a pilchard cellar or a pressing plant or a net store or a boat yard or something. It's a real intricate network on a very tight scale, and this contrasts greatly with what happened in the later 19th century. Porthmeor, the Great Beach or the Great Porth, and this is, if you like, the sand engine that was driving all the sand over into the harbour, over the neck of the land leading up to the island. This was the sand that Smeaton was keen to keep out of the harbour. His solution was to build a huge wall. Now, the wall that was built, that you can see with all the buildings standing up at the moment, is on a different alignment to what Smeaton proposed, but in the end it took a shorter, cheaper and quicker route across the beach. What we can see is built out of Blue Elven, which is the hard greenstone rock coming from the headlands either side of the beach. Underneath the stand is another 21 foot of solid granite wall. At times this sand has built up so it reaches the first floor windows of the buildings behind us. This was a huge amount of sand to keep back. But it wasn't just the sand that they were protecting against. There are good records from 1596 and from the 1640s of defensive bulwarks along what was known as Porthmeor Bank, which was the back line of the beach, defending against invasion from the Spanish and against attack by royalist forces during the Civil War. St Ives was one of the few parliamentarian strongholds in Cornwall at the time. For such a huge construction, we actually know relatively little about the building of the wall. We know that it was being completed about 1800, 1801, and we know that the very first buildings on the back of the wall were there by about 1810. Now that's of interest to us because those first buildings appear to be on the site of the Porthmeor Studios. Now, rather like a bypass around a modern town, as soon as you build a huge wall like this, effectively what you do is to create development space behind. And it wasn't long before the spaces between the old town and the new wall were filled in with fish cellars, cooperages, storage huts. These gradually expanded until, by the mid-19th century, the whole of this area had become a huge industrial complex. And I say industrial, it's fishing, but it's on an industrial scale. By the 1880s, when the artists were flocking to St Ives, they were looking at this area as a suitable place to put their studios. And the first studio that we know of along here was built in 1886. It was converted from a net loft by the American artist Howard Butler. And again, we believe that's at Porthmeor Studios. He came back 9 years later, and every single one of these buildings along here by then had their upper floors converted to studios, looking pretty much like they do now. But the only group that survives in anything like its original form is, of course, Porthmeor itself, which is the great block of studio windows and slate-hung gables that you can see in the middle of the wall. Despite being so built up, Porthmeor is one of those few places where you can still get a sense of the topography of this part of St Ives. You can still see the beach, the back line of the cliff along which the old road runs. On this side was open grazing, beach, people were drying their nets, there were a few huts, a few fishing boats. On that side was the town. The names of roads often give you huge clues as to what was going on in the town. This is Back Road. It literally means the back road to the town. The town, the harbour, is over to the south. All the little lanes coming up to this lane splay out in triangular shapes where they met the open grazing and the common land of the town. On the seaward side are all the tight 19th century terraces, an entire industrial quarter on that side of the road. Well, here we are in what's known as Cellar 1, and above us is the big block of studios built in the 1890s, including Julius Olson's School of Painting. This is the key to the whole site, if you like. In here, you can see all the bits and pieces of St Ives history in this part of the town. It's a microcosm, it's a document that you can read, and it can tell you everything you want to know about the 19th century of St Ives. Behind me is the inside of the Porthmeor Wall, and you can see it's a huge, great big defence against the sand. And against this wall were built the very earliest buildings in this area. They butt up against the wall. We know they're slightly later. And the remains of what is possibly the first building in this part of St Ives are still here, over in the corner. And you can see the blue elven stone there. And we know that it's there about 1810. The fascinating thing about this building, and one of the reasons why it's so interesting, is because although everything here is 1810 to 1910, 1930s at the most, within that 100-year period, 120-year period, there are no less than 30 odd different phases of development. Every 4 or 5 years, the owners of this site were trying something new, something different, to try and make this site pay. Whether it's fishing, whether it's as a cooperage, making the barrels for the fishing and the trade. And in the very fabric of this building is all the evidence of all those different things that made St Ives the unique place it was. Now, obviously, one of the key things this site was used for in its early days was pilchard pressing. And there is plenty of evidence here surviving from the cobbled floors, the channels to take away the train oil, the weights that were used to hang off the end of the pressing beams. There's a lot of evidence that isn't here. There are no pressing slots or corbelled walls, which we would expect, but that's because the building's been rebuilt and reused over time. That's the earliest phase. It's such a complicated site. We actually did quite a lot of archaeology here. We literally dug up the floor to see what was going on, and we found evidence of the pilchards, we found evidence of the cooperage, we found evidence of 3 or 4 different buildings. It's really difficult to actually pinpoint what date they are and when they changed, because they're changing so rapidly, you don't get that build-up of layers that you would get in a normal archaeological investigation. The building as it currently looks is actually the product of largely one man, George Williams. He was a cooper by trade. He was mayor of St Ives in the 1870s, twice. He had various property interests around the town. This was his major investment. And in the 1880s and 1890s, he's not only investing in pilchard cellars and pressing yards, he's also deliberately building studios for the artists. He's cashing in on that new trend. And in 1895, he develops this site, probably with the help of Julius Olson, who at the time was the principal artist in residence, as it were, in St Ives. And he builds a massive studio complex above this cellar, using industrial techniques of construction and using whatever's to hand. Now, in the 1880s and 1890s, lots of the traditional industries in St Ives are collapsing. The mining industry is on its last legs. The pilchard industry is on its last legs. Even shipping is changing in its very nature. And you can imagine lying around the St Ives harbour area are the very materials that George Williams needs to build this site. And when you look around this building, what do you find? You find huge, great timbers, 60-foot timbers supporting the floors. Now those are actually mine pump rods. These are the huge timbers that were used to go down the mines to work the engines, to work the machinery within the mines. They clearly were never used in the mines because they would still be down there now. So they're a testament to the collapse of the mining industry, the unused material, exactly the same as the huge timbers used as pit props. There are cast iron rising mains. These were the pipes that normally would be down the mine pumping out all the water. Again, had they been used in the mines, they would still be down there. There are reused ship's masts and ship's timbers throughout this building. In this building there is, if you like, what's left over from the collapse of all the other traditional industries in St Ives. It's a document, it's a testament to that changing economy and activity in the town in the late 19th century. The word unique is very much overused when it comes to historic buildings, but actually perhaps in this instance it's one that you can really use. There are artist studios still all over St Ives. There are still the remains of fishing cellars and pilchard cellars and net lofts all over St Ives. You can go into the various buildings and still see the evidence for them. But here at Porthmeor is the only place where you still have working fishing gear, store, cellars and artist studios in the same complex. It's possibly the only place like it, not only in St Ives, in the country, who knows, in the world. It really is unique.